how do we go beyond minimizing our own carbon footprint? We all know about reusing and recycling and all those things, but how do we thrive and feel good in a climate changed world? I have very great pleasure in introducing Dr. Dominic Walker, who is an analyst in energy and the net zero transition at the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, helping to decarbonize the UK energy system ahead of net zero by 2050. That's quite a mouthful, but what's really exciting is that his PhD explored the role of art in communicating environmental change. I thought that showed a very broad-minded person. So he says he's going to speak from his personal perspective and not be a mouthpiece of the government. But on the other hand, if you have questions to ask him which involve the government, feel free to ask them. And on the subject of questions, whenever something occurs to you, please just write your question in the chat. And after Dominic has finished speaking, we will get to them. So over to you, Dominic.
Thanks, Jane. Hello, everyone. Very happy to be speaking with you all tonight. What I will do is I will see if I can just share my screen. Let's see if we can get us started. Okay, the technical issue to start with, the option has dropped off the screen. So what I may do is have to speak to you without my notes. So you'll have to bear with me if it ends up being a little bit sketchy. Right. Let's see if I can share.
Oh, there we go. Something came.
Okay, and hopefully everyone can see my screen okay. Just to flag, in when I'm sharing screen like this, I can't see other people or see hands or anything like that. So if you do have questions, as Jane said, do please put them in the sidebar. So today what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about hopefully how we can turn the sort of challenge of climate change into something which we can adapt to and learn to sort of thrive off as we make certain changes. So what I'm going to do today is take you through a little bit about sort of firstly why we need to do anything at all, and why do we need to do it now, so what's wrong with things the way they are, and then after that sort of go through what are some of the things that we can do to help adapt on a government level, as citizens in challenging our government to make those changes, and then on a community level, so where we sort of operate in groups, again as citizens sort of mobilize ourselves, what can we do within our communities to help sort of further that impact. I've also prepared a short section which I won't cover in the main talk. Just as Jane said, it's things that we're sort of fairly familiar with: personal changes, changing your energy to sustainable provider, changing your pension so that they don't invest in fossil fuels, etc. But there are some useful links and resources in amongst that. So what I will do is, if it's okay with everyone here, I'm happy to distribute slides afterwards so that you can go through some of those at your leisure. So why do we need to do anything at all? Well, this
What on earth is that?
this graph is taken from Vostok in Antarctica, and it shows the temperature going back about 400,000 years. You'll see that these top three lines here, very squiggly, but they all seem to show the same pattern. They all seem to mirror one another. So they all tend to go up at the same point and they come down at the same point, and they go up and they come down, go up and come down. So this shows that effectively they speak to each other quite closely, and when one rises, the others rise. The top line up here is carbon dioxide in parts per million. We've then got temperature down here, the next one down, and on the third one down, we've got methane. And given that all of these go up and come down together, that tells us that they're all related. Carbon dioxide and methane, of course, are greenhouse gases, which effectively means that they let in heat and warmth from the sun, but they don't let much of it out. one of the other things to notice here is the concentration of these in the atmosphere at different times as well. So carbon dioxide here on the left-hand side ranges from between about 200 parts per million up to a little bit above 280, so we'll say about 300. Methane is between sort of just under 400 and 700 parts per billion. And then we've got temperature over here. So that varies from -8 up to +2. So effectively, what this shows is that at different points when we have low methane and when we have low carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the temperature here goes to the bottom end of that scale, which is -8. And when we have high carbon dioxide and high methane, the temperature goes to the top of that scale, which is +2. So within those ranges, there's about a 10 degrees Celsius warming that can happen. To give you some sort of indication as to where we are today, so carbon dioxide concentration as of spring this year was up at 419 parts per million. So where we look here, and for the last 400,000 years or so, carbon dioxide has never got above 300. We are now at 419. So if that were to be on this graph, it would be way up the top. Similar story with methane. Historically, we haven't gone above 700 parts per billion. But across 2021, we were up at 1,895 parts per billion. So that effectively tells us that as we increase those, we can see from this graph, when they go up, the temperature goes up too. So they've gone up a lot, so we can expect that the temperature will also go up to follow that. To give an indication of temperature here, so I've mentioned it's a sort of 10 degree Celsius swing, so it's about 18 Fahrenheit. To give a rough idea of what that translates to, a temperature change of about 3 to 4 Celsius across the world is enough to be the difference between being in an ice age and being in a period with no ice. So it's a very significant change to be talking about 10 Celsius. And another thing to note here is that changes like this take time, and they don't happen overnight. So to give an example of this, these are what we call feedback cycles, which influence things. So if we take some sea ice, let's say we've got 100 square foot of sea ice, and the sea ice is very white and very bright. As sunlight comes in, it hits that white surface and gets reflected, as does the heat. It gets scattered by that bright surface. However, as we continue to put out more carbon, etc., that warms the air. So instead of having maybe 100 square foot of ice, perhaps maybe now we have 80 square foot of ice. So there's now a little bit less to reflect out, and that 20 square foot that was ice is now water, which generally is much darker when it's over a sea and absorbs the heat rather than reflecting it because it's not as bright. So that then warms it further, and next maybe you get 50 square foot, and round you go until there's nothing left. So that's an example of what we call a feedback loop, and there are hundreds of those the world over, operating in different ways. But this effectively happens over a period of time. In natural cycles, that 100 square foot one winter would maybe drop down to, I don't know, 99. The next winter, maybe 98. The winter after that generally would go quite slowly. So that means it usually takes hundreds of years, sometimes even thousands of years, for these feedback loops to come into their own. However, they can be speeded up. And one of the things that speeds them up is increasing these greenhouse gas emissions. So this is a graph showing the amount of carbon dioxide that has been produced across the world. As you can see back here in 1950, we were at around 5 billion tons a year. By sort of 2019, that we've gone up over sevenfold, over 35 billion tons. And this is on top of what's already in the atmosphere. So this is being added every year, which effectively means with such large amounts of carbon going up, we're effectively turning that thermostat up. As we know from the previous graph, the more carbon there is, the warmer the temperature tends to get. And this accelerates the melting of that ice. So if we talked about, we've got the 100 square foot and it would sort of go 99, 98, 97. When you're increasing it this fast, perhaps maybe it goes 100 to 85 or 100 to 80 and then down to 75, 60, 40, something like that. So it definitely changes that speed simply because we're trying to warm things up very fast. But there's also a sort of time element here as well. Carbon dioxide tends to survive in the atmosphere for well in excess of 100 years. So, for example, about 40% of the emissions from Henry Ford's Model T back in 1911 are still circulating in the upper atmosphere today. And this means that effectively every molecule of carbon that we emit will carry on warming the planet for well over the next sort of 100 years or so. So this is one reason why we need to do something now, effectively to reduce the amount of new carbon that we're putting in the air and to reduce the amount of new warming which we're locking in as we go along. So just to quickly sort of flick back to this very intimidating graph, there was one last thing on it that I wanted to draw your attention to, and that's that circle around about the 200 parts per million of carbon dioxide with an arrow pointing to it. Now this period was a period about 12,000 years ago. The temperature, as you see, is fairly stable compared to all of the ups and downs from the previous thousands of years. And this stability of temperature really changed the way that humans did things. Up until this point, humans were fairly nomadic, would be moving around a lot. But as the temperature stabilized, it effectively allowed us to stay in one place. This is because we could reasonably predict what the seasons would bring more or less in each area. A pattern started to emerge, and that pattern brought a semblance of predictability. This meant that we could effectively plant seeds, we could grow food, because we could start to predict what the weather would be for each season. So we could start to predict when to harvest it. And eventually, as you're there for enough years, you start to get better at growing, better at harvesting, to the extent that you can produce more food than you need. Confident that you wouldn't starve, for instance. And that excess you can keep, and you can use it to ride out sort of a rough winter or a crop failure, but you can also use it for trade. So effectively, once this was sort of set in motion and we were able to stay in one place, not only did it allow us to develop into things like villages, towns, and cities, but it also gave birth to some of the earliest forms of sort of organized trade, which would then sort of develop into early forms of what we describe as mercantile capitalism. So effectively, that period of a settled climate was absolutely essential for us, and it's something which we still rely on today. It's still sort of taken for granted and assumed, to the extent that our food systems and trade systems still depend on it. However, that's sort of where we have been, but we're now started to rapidly change things. And to give a sense of how fast we're changing things, this top graph here is taken from NASA, and it shows our temperature. It shows carbon dioxide concentration going back 800,000 years. So it's a very long time. And we see it goes up and down, it goes up and down, up and down. And it's fairly sort of consistent. It doesn't tend to get above 300 parts per million. And as it goes up, we reach stages where there's very little or no ice on Earth. We call those interglacials. And then it's always followed by a period crashing back down, which takes us into our ice ages. So what we're looking at here is effectively different periods where the Earth has been in and out of ice ages. Around about 200,000 years ago is when modern day humans started to evolve, and effectively we've had, as you follow this through, sort of significant ice age, significant interglacial. And then something curious happened. As we emerged from our last ice age, the carbon dioxide concentration increased, as it has done on all the other occasions. But instead of it coming back down, as it has done on all of the others, it goes up and comes down, goes up and comes down, it hasn't come down. Effectively, what you would expect to be entering a new ice age, as scientists in the 70s believed that we would, effectively, because that's where we always have been, the sheer amount of carbon that we've been pumping out has had a warming effect so significant that it has stopped us from entering that ice age, and instead has created a new warming trend. Now, this development from sort of ice ages to an interglacial usually takes thousands of years. So when we look at these lines that go upwards, they're slightly diagonal. They don't go straight up, and they're slightly diagonal because it takes them thousands of years to come about. So they tend to sort of creep up bit by bit. However, this last line changes that completely. When we look at that 1950 level and we look at where we are today, that is almost a completely vertical line. And this effectively says that where previously it took thousands of years to change the Earth's atmosphere and to change the temperature, we're now doing it in decades. So this is another significant reason as to why we need to do something now, because it means we're accelerating feedback loops and tipping points very fast. So that effectively means that as we start to accelerate those feedback loops, say ice melts so fast that they go to a period where there is no ice, that then means you've effectively crossed what we call a tipping point, where the water is warm enough to mean that there will be no ice, because the water is simply too warm for it to form. And when that happens, the Earth is effectively in a new climatic state. It becomes very, very difficult to come back from that. And so as we've increased the amount of carbon very quickly, we've also would expect to see increased warming, as we found out from that previous graph. And that is exactly what we've started to see here as well, over the last 140 or so years. So what does this mean? Well, at the moment, we're on course for about 2.5 to 2.9 Celsius of warming. That's the sort of global average. And as I said, about between 3 and 4 Celsius of warming is the difference between putting the Earth in an ice age or taking it out of one. So it's a very significant amount of warming. Another thing to note here is this model ends at the year 2100, but of course time doesn't. So effectively, what we need to be mindful of is that what we're doing at the moment is locking in warming for effectively hundreds of years. Once those feedback loops kick in, we go past those tipping points, that then effectively starts to take on a life of its own. It starts to become out of our control. Where are we at the moment? Well, we're currently at around 1 degree Celsius of warming across the planet. Just here in the UK, this has already had some impacts. This is just a very sort of rough and ready guide. This is looking at the top 10 hottest days in the UK on record, stretching back to the 1700s. And as you'll see, 9 out of the 10 of them have been since the year 1990. 7 out of the 10 of them have been since the year 2000. And in fact, the hottest day of the 1976 heat wave doesn't even feature in the top 10 anymore. So there's been significant warming, and it's mostly concentrated most recently. And that sort of image at the top shows the difference between sort of a one-off event that may previously have happened and the pattern that we're now seeing of widespread warming across most areas of the planet on a regular basis. So what can we expect? Well, going forward, generally the climate can be expected to become more unstable. And this unfortunately makes the planet a little bit more hostile than something that we've come to expect. This means that effectively our sort of black swan events that were quite rare, sort of the 1 in 500 year droughts from Europe, that sort of thing from this summer, those start to become a bit more regular than 1 in 500 years. But there's also sort of the indirect impacts as well, the things behind the sort of droughts, the floods, the sea level rise, crop failures, all the things that we sort of hear about in the headlines. There are more indirect consequences too. So one example of that is what I put on the screen there, which is around disease. So effectively, as we start changing the climate on a planetary scale, that effectively makes places more uninhabitable for wildlife. Either it gets too hot, too wet, whatever it is, and they need to move to survive. And they have to move at very short notice, don't have time to evolve into living in a new area. So as they move, that puts them in contact with other wildlife and that they wouldn't usually encounter, and with humans. And in the same way that we have thousands of different viruses and bacteria living within us at any one time that don't cause us any harm, the same is also true of wildlife. And when you start putting those together, effectively it creates one big party between these sort of viruses and bacteria, which gives them a chance to interact with one another and to mutate. And when that happens, it gives a chance to infect across species. And this is something that we've already seen happen quite a lot in the last 20 years. We've seen it in particular with SARS, we've seen it with MERS, with swine flu, with bird flu, with Zika, with the West Nile virus, and also with COVID-19. And all of these diseases have very similar hallmarks of how they originated, about those different organisms being mashed together and effectively new viruses mutating and jumping between species. So that's one of them. Another indirect effect is a similar sort of idea in terms of movement. If you make more areas of the planet uninhabitable, the people that live in those areas of the planet are going to need to move for the same reason as wildlife, simply to survive, to find new livelihoods and to find new ways of living. So what can we do about this? Where do we thrive? So one thing to note is that it is absolutely possible, and in fact, we've shown it in different ways, that it is very, very easy, or perhaps maybe not easy, but certainly possible to reduce carbon emissions, but still have very good standard of living. This graph shows the different amount of carbon dioxide produced by each person in different countries in 2019. Australia and the USA, for instance, produce about 16 tons of carbon dioxide per person. Here in the UK, we produce much less than that. We're about sort of 5.5, but that's still significantly more than France, Portugal, countries like that, and Sweden as well. Sweden produces around 3 tons of carbon dioxide per capita. So that's about less than a fifth of what the average American produces. And yet Sweden is one of the most developed countries on earth. It has very high standard of living, it has very high educational and healthcare systems, and yet they still produce much less carbon emissions than we do here. So it is very possible to do with the right levers in place. So what do some of those levers look like? Well, effectively, for government, there's quite a long to-do list. One of the things, and one of the most important things that needs to happen fast, is simply a rapid dismantling of fossil fuels. There's very little negotiation about that if we're to avoid the worst effects of climate change. I think personally, one of the steps we could start to take for that is to ban fossil fuel delegates from COP meetings. At COP27, there were over 300 delegates, which was more than most countries that were there, which is sort of akin to having the tobacco industry at a healthcare conference. It doesn't really seem to fit very well. So that would be a very important first step to take, I think. Another thing that would help strengthen that case would be for governments to simply stop subsidizing fossil fuels. Between the Paris Agreement, the end of 2015, which was lauded as a big sort of event, the world taking climate change seriously, up until 2019, those same governments handed out over $3 trillion in subsidies straight to fossil fuel corporations to artificially lower the price of fossil fuels, including coal, oil, gas, the main ones, to effectively keep them cheap enough so that we keep using them. And if you're hoping that this was something that was sort of pre-COVID, we're sort of over that, we've learned from it. In 2021, 700 billion was given in just that 1 year. So this is very much something which is still alive. I would argue that if governments are hell-bent on giving such large amounts of taxpayer money straight over to other such corporations, I would instead recommend to use that to subsidize renewables. The graph on the right-hand side here, these charts show the different types of renewable energy, from sort of solar, onshore, offshore wind, and you see all of them have started to decrease significantly in price. That grey band at the bottom is the cost of fossil fuels per unit, and that's with subsidies, and these renewables are primarily without. So you can imagine just how cheap they would be if we applied the same subsidies to them. Next thing is decarbonising power sectors. And this is something which here in the UK we take very seriously. There's been a lot of significant work and pledges being done to try and speed this up. It's a combination of sort of demand and supply side effects. So effectively finding ways for consumers to use less gas, but also finding ways to give us less gas so that we use other forms of energy instead. And the most important way to do that is effectively to make electricity cheaper than gas for consumers, which would really shake up the way that we heat our homes and use our day-to-day energy. Following that sort of shake-up idea is using market signals. And this has become really, really important from sort of different government positions from different countries over the last few years. If a country positions itself as continuing to use its oil and gas reserves, its coal reserves, its fossil fuels effectively, then that sends a signal to investors that if they want to make money, they need to invest in these fossil fuel supplies because that's where the country is making their investment. However, if that same country decides to invest and make pledges around renewable energy, that effectively sends the opposite signal to investors that says if you want to make money, you need to invest in renewable projects here. And for that country, it effectively puts us in a pioneering position. So it means that we are one of the first ones there. We're there early, and we know it's an area that's going to expand over the next few decades. So it gives us a bigger market share. It gives us the opportunity to recruit and use the skills to effectively put us in a position to make us big players, which we can then use to our advantage. We can now export and sell to other countries going forward. So it makes a big, big difference. Although it is granted been quite difficult with different changes over the last few years. And this sort of leads on to the next point around how we interact with other countries. It's very, very easy to sort of lambast other countries and say they're not pulling their weight, others need to do more. That is true. Other countries, some countries do more than others, definitely. But one of the ways to help change that is to show what benefits investing in the right forms of technologies and providing the right opportunities bring. Once those benefits become so obvious and so much more distinct, it makes the case for switching over to them irresistible. So I would argue it makes more sense to simply to lead other countries and encourage them to follow our example rather than attacking them. One of the things which government could do in terms of sort of adapting as we go forward towards different types of weather is to adapt in smarter agricultural practices. So this is using technology in different ways, but it's also using more weather-resistant crops, such as I've listed a few there: fonio, amaranth, cowpeas, and taro. They're all currently grown. They're all nutritious, and they all are much more hardy. In the West, a lot of our diet involves wheat, maize, and in particular, those two are quite susceptible to droughts and flooding. Yield has been estimated to drop anywhere between 30 to 40% up until about 2050 with no action. So once that yield starts changing, that of course has knock-on effects for price. So definitely involving more weather-resistant crops gives us more resilience so that when those events happen, there are other things we can switch to. And speaking of switching over, a significant area which I think is lacking in some countries in particular is encouraging different measures around how buildings are set up. So most of these things don't have to be reinventing the wheel. Here in the UK, for instance, our summers are forecast to get a lot warmer. In fact, the Climate Change Committee suggested in a 2019 report that by 2040, the average UK summer would look something akin to Barcelona's current summer. So that suggests that we can look to see how housing in Barcelona copes with that. How do they deal with it year on year? It's not on another planet. They're here with us, and they experience that heat regularly. So what are some of the things we can learn from them? What are the materials that they use for their buildings? They use tiles in the floors, they use stone and other sort of cooling materials to make the buildings. They use shutters. They paint buildings white to reflect heat. All those sorts of things would very much help. So there's an opportunity to learn from others and to take those forward, and to provide opportunities for us to retrofit our buildings accordingly. Another big one that has been going up the agenda is around switching diets. It's not a case of cutting things out completely, but simply just reducing consumption of certain things. And the British public has responded very well to this, and the vast majority in a Gallup poll suggested that they already have reduced their meat and dairy consumption, and that is exactly the right way to go in terms of reducing the carbon footprint on the planet. In addition to that, looking a bit more broadly, protecting the oceans and rainforests. The oceans absorb about 30% of the planet's carbon dioxide, and in doing so, it makes them much more acidic. That acidity affects the shells of, in particular, carbonate organisms. It weakens them, it effectively makes them vulnerable, and that affects their food chain. It also bleaches coral reefs, and there have been several bleaching events over the last few years, which makes it very difficult for those coral reefs to come back from and to survive. They also cause marine heat waves, which very much not a situation that marine wildlife want to be in. So that's a big one. Rainforests, the Amazon, once thought of as the lungs of the planet, has now been so deforested that it now actually emits, it gives out more carbon dioxide than it's capable of absorbing. So much of it has been cleared, and so much of that has then been used to plant particular types of grain, which then feed cattle. And as cattle produce methane, which, as we've seen, is a significant warming factor too. Similar sort of idea following sort of rewilding. This is taking off in the UK, certainly in discourse. And this is a similar sort of idea of producing a lot more vegetation to allow carbon dioxide to be drawn out the atmosphere and provide more biodiversity. Greening urban spaces, very similar idea, just using vegetation in urban spaces, provide that reduction in carbon dioxide, and joining up with other countries on all of these ideas always helps strengthen the case. I think the last and most significant thing for governments is to move beyond economic growth as the idea of success. It doesn't mean we have to abandon it and we have to say we don't care about the economy, but what it does mean is we should look at in what way are we achieving that growth and at what cost. I would argue if you make £100, but you make that through poisoning a food supply, for instance, yes, you may have the money, but you've caused far more damage than you would otherwise. There's also a more detailed list, which I won't go into here, which the IPCC have produced for governments. So what can we do to help encourage governments to make some of these changes, for instance? Top of the list, although I suppose I would say this working in government, is to respond to public consultations. So this is anytime we make new laws or we make new policies, they go out to public consultation. So it's your chance as citizens to feed up your views on what's been proposed. And they're advertised on the government website, use the search function, and we really do read them and we really do make real policy changes based on them. So that's always a good first step. Another significant one is vote. And I don't just mean the national elections, I mean local elections, council elections, anyone who has an opportunity for power in even sort of local, regional, national level has the opportunity to influence things under their control. And the environment is one of those. So have a look. What are their pledges? What are they saying that they will do? If they're a mainstream political party or a big political party, have a look at their manifesto. What's on there? If climate isn't on there or you don't like what they're proposing, don't give them your vote. We have to assume that what's on there is what they will follow through with. And if it's something which you feel don't agree with and the climate is important to you, then maybe they need to try a different way. If you're not sure what they're proposing, give them a Google. I'm sure it will turn up. If it's sort of a local councillor and that doesn't come up, get in touch with them, drop them an email, ask them. For those of you who are more sort of drawn to people rather than parties, perhaps, if you follow that link there, that takes you to a website called theyworkforyou.com, which is a list of every parliamentary vote done since I think about 2005. So you can type in the politician that you're interested in, and it will tell you how they voted on the environment in every single vote since then. So you can find out if what they're saying matches how they've actually voted. Sign petitions as well. Sometimes the old ones are the best. Change.org, that link there has made it easier than ever to sign petitions. So I definitely recommend doing that. The next thing on the list is to join groups such as this with other like-minded people across country and other countries. And it really helps build momentum, and it really helps share ideas and develop that thinking that we have as a group. And that sort of leads on to this idea of just effectively talking. Anyone and everyone, as many people as you can, just keeping it in the mind's eye, keeping it as part of that conversation, because that will help fuel thinking that people can do and to help improve things. You can also use media, so you can either write letters, emails, whatever your bag is, use social media, blog, podcast, whatever it is, but definitely use that platform. The UN has listed useful recipients of those media if you're going through letters and emails. I'll come on to those in just a second. But the key thing is to sort of make it a core part of your identity and your habits, as you'll notice it a bit more once you start doing that. So just sort of conscious of time, I'll very quickly go through on the community side. To be honest, it's similar sort of story to on the government side in many things. So again, local council elections and working with local government leaders. If you follow that link there, just click on that, it will take you through to this UN website, which gives you a breakdown of different ways which you can engage with local government leaders across different areas. And going one step further than that, you can find out what sort of ecological issues there are in your area. How can you get involved? What's happening? Town meetings, local newsletters, information boards in local supermarkets, they're all really good places to start. If in doubt, Google it. Find out what's happening in your area. There's a practical one there, just something which I think was touched on a couple of talks ago, just sharing equipment among neighbours, particularly the big ticket items that are used once maybe and then never used again. Just effectively means they don't have to be produced each time. I think probably one of the most important ones is that last point though, looking after each other and building resilience. Effectively, as the climate starts to shift, there will be events which will affect our communities. They will be maybe when it hasn't stopped raining for 5, 6, 7, 8 days in a row and the water's getting a little bit higher than it was. People are getting concerned. Or maybe there have been 3 or 4 storms in quick succession like there were last winter, and people's roof tiles have been blown off or windows have been smashed and they need a bit more support or they need a bit of help. So do get to know your neighbours, do get to know your communities. It will all help when we face unexpected shocks. The last bit I'll just talk through very quickly, just effectively keeping abreast of new stuff that's coming out. So quick plug for the conversation there. They're an organisation which are free and they put out new academic research every day. They take about 2 minutes to read each of the articles. You can subscribe and they give you a daily newsletter for free. There are loads of other great organisations. I've listed a few there, which you can also engage with. Right, I think I will hold it there in the interest of time and hand over to questions.
Thank you very much indeed. That would extreme amount of information in a very short amount of time. But I think you said you were going to send us your slides, so we'll be able to absorb them at our leisure as well. And there are quite a few questions. So I'm going to
excellent. That's what we like
have
to
a look
hear.
at the chat. If you have a look at the chat and I have a look at the chat, starting from the top, I made it so big I can't see anything else. Just a minute. That's better. So a couple of messages that are just for me. Okay, so Rosie says, no, not that one. That was just for me as well. Surely planning policy should be moving to make it compulsory to insulate, build in a way that copes with the new climate. I think she's saying, as opposed to, you know, you were suggesting that it'd be a good idea, surely it should be compulsory. So that's a comment for your thoughts.
Completely agree. Yes, definitely.
So is there any chance of that happening?
I mean, at different points there have been effectively different pushes to do just that. It seems to sort of go in cycles. Every couple of years there's a new incentive put out by government, a new policy which encourages those measures. I think the latest was the Green Homes Grant in sort of 2020, 2021. But the difficulty we have is usually finding it in a consistent way. So previous schemes have been pulled mainly because of teething issues, mainly because effectively the practicalities of it hasn't worked out the way that they've planned. So I like to think that on each occasion they're learning from them and moving them forward, but progress has been a lot slower than it, in my opinion, should have been. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's very disappointing when there is a grant and then all of a sudden you find there isn't any more. It's been pulled for some reason.
It's been pulled, or it's been promised, and you've got in touch with people who then have been so booked up they haven't been able to do the work before the grant's been pulled.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so another question. In the UK, how are subsidies passed to the oil and gas industry? For example, is it exemption from taxes others pay, or how does it work? So we know that oil and gas industries are subsidized, but how does that happen?
So yeah, a lot of the time it's tax breaks. A lot of the time it is investing in certain areas, so they can receive tax breaks or they can receive extra money to invest in certain parts of the country, or to bring particular high value jobs. Often there's sort of different mechanisms at play. The UK has previously been quite an attractive place simply because we don't tend to tax corporations very highly compared to a lot of other countries, so that naturally makes us quite attractive. So it's usually either lower taxes or tax breaks.
So I don't know if you're the right person to ask this, but we have a lady who asks the same question re Australia.
Or Australia. I'm afraid I'm not the right person there. But I am pleased that she's interested to find out. Yes, and unfortunately I don't know.
Probably similar, but we don't actually know. Is there a green way to use gas? I think the asker of that question is sitting in a room which is about 10 degrees at the moment because his heating's broken down, so it's a bit of a topical question for him.
Yes, yeah, and it's a horrible timing. Gas is a funny one because for a period of time it was sort of heralded as a green solution, and part of that was because by using gas it meant that we could wind down our use of coal. And natural gas is definitely cleaner than coal, but natural gas of course is not clean, it is just cleaner than coal. So for a long time that's sort of been the narrative, but when you compare it to, for instance, heat pumps, or you compare it to hydrogen, it's significantly more carbon intensive than those. So generally try and swap to as much electricity as possible, which is made harder because electricity is a lot more expensive per unit at the moment. So it is something that within our department I think people are aware of, and I think there are hopefully mechanisms at work to try and redress that.
Okay, thank you. Would burning methane help instead of gas out of the ground?
So depending on the country, natural gas is often methane, or is often a significant portion of it being methane. So to an extent, not really, unfortunately. I mean, some of these get more complicated because, for instance, you have carbon capture, usage and storage. So if you were to implement that on a larger scale, yes, you could burn them so long as you capture the carbon dioxide. In practice, it's not quite that simple because that carbon dioxide then has to be buried somewhere under extreme high pressure. So there are sort of more complications and it's very expensive to do so. But as a sort of a long-term transition, the short answer to that question is unfortunately not. Okay.
That sounded like quite a comprehensive answer to that question. I hope Andreas is happy, but surely he will tell us if he's not. Christine Davis says, is there any progress to heating the person, i.e. heating clothing, as opposed to heating the building in the future? An interesting question.
That is an interesting question. Yeah. The short answer is I can't say that it's been discussed at great level within my circles at work. I think it is a useful area. I think that will probably start to gain a little bit more traction over the next couple of years as we contend with these high prices. But for the moment, I'd say it's still too early to say.
Yeah, and my comment to that is that it's all very well if you're wearing warm clothes, but your fingers still get terribly cold and you can't do much. So you'd have to have terribly clever gloves to allow
Yeah,
you to be able to do things up wearing them.
yeah,
Anyway.
and it's things like sort of a colder temperature in your house just means that, for instance, you're more susceptible to things like mold, damp, and all those types of issues as well. So there would be a little bit more thinking, but it's an interesting idea.
Yes, but it's an interesting area of technology, I'm sure. There should be developments in that. Okay, so Alison Derrick says, I'm amazed that biodigesters, which I was aware of 30 years ago, are not much used anymore. There is the potential to remove a huge pollutant, manure, and make it into a fabulous fertilizer, but I hear very little about it.
Yes, so there are different things which have sort of been played about with in different ways to form part of biomass use within sort of the energy mix. I'm not quite sure what those look like at the moment. It's not something that I have worked closely enough with to give an answer on that. But yeah, definitely, I think a lot of the time there's a tendency to sort of reinvent the wheel, when sometimes some of the simplest solutions are the most effective and have been around for some time. Simply moving from a car to a bicycle. A bicycle's been around for a long time, but it's very effective, and it helps produce one of the solutions we want. So it would definitely be something that I'd be interested to hear more about, for sure.
Philip Sheehan again. Yes, why isn't infrared heating more popular? Heat the body and the structure, not the air. Yes, quite. Oh, wow, this is a long one. Okay, Henry says, as a gardener, it has been getting increasingly difficult to grow food crops that rely on seasons. I would say here to that. Many of our staple foods are biennial crops. We eat them in the first year before they flower in the second year, but they think they have gone through winter and flower far too early. Carrots, parsnips, beetroot, blah, 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 etc. The peas just fried this year. Who is looking at replacement food crops?
So that generally falls within DEFRA's remit. My understanding is there is some work which is effectively having a look at that. I don't know how developed it is, and I don't know how sort of policy ready it is, but it is on the radar. And I think in particular, farmers have had an incredibly difficult few years, even putting aside the cost of living side, just from a weather perspective. So that has bumped it further up the agenda in any case, to try and sort of help that out. Whether enough is being done, I don't know enough about it. But there's definitely opportunities, as I mentioned in my talk, there's a lot of different weather resistant crops that would do perfectly well in the UK if given the chance.
And as you said, for us to learn from what crops people use in countries which have higher temperatures or less stable climates, presumably we can learn a lot from them.
Definitely.
Okay, so lots of people saying amazing, great talk, thank you. And then there's another question here. Dominic, you rightly mentioned that the UK has an impressive record of decarbonising our energy sector. However, apart from that, it is not clear the government wants to engage with climate change issues, which are much longer than the election cycle. Is the government even prepared to listen?
Ooh, this is a tricky question. It's made even trickier by my role. No, I think there's been a lot of mixed messaging on this. My own feeling is that some in government are more aware of the severity of climate issues than others. I think that direction often can change. It does sort of depend on who's got the levers and where that influence follows. It's definitely higher up the agenda than it's ever been before. 2019, I think, was quite a turning point for that. And any government that wants to win the next election seriously needs to consider climate change much more. There was a recent, which poll was it? There was one poll, I forget the organization that ran it, but there was a poll effectively about 3 months ago that suggested climate change was the second most pressing concern of UK citizens at the moment, behind only the cost of living crisis. So it is right up there, and over 2/3 of UK population are either slightly concerned or very concerned about climate change. So any government that wants to govern needs to take that seriously, because each of those people have a vote. So if they don't take it seriously, it will be at their peril.
And you think they're realizing that?
I think yes is the short answer, but if I'm honest, I think some areas don't really know what to do about it. So I think that they're sort of at a bit of a crossroads. But you know, this, to an extent, it's across the board really. We're in a tight sort of fiscal place. Difficult decisions need to be made, and a lot of these things, in my mind, are among the most important facing the country. But they need money to do it. So it's, yeah. I would say there's more awareness around it, but I can't say what that will translate into.
So we need to put more pressure on them. Always
does no harm.
So Chris Davis says, all the hydrocarbon gases we burn have CO2 as an output, except hydrogen, but then only green hydrogen. I'm not sure what the question is. Chris, do you want to explain? Or
So they're just comments. That it's not a it's just a fact. It's not a question. But somebody asked about burning methane as an alternative, and I was just saying it's not a good idea, really.
Okay. So it's a comment. Kathy says we do capture and burn methane that is released from organic matter landfill, although we can't capture all of it, and some escapes into the atmosphere. Oh yes, Rosie's commenting, I've heard about this as well. There are some very fashionable new things which are basically blankets with sleeves. And
slankets, I think they call them.
I think a lot of home workers have been adopting them, and I think an awful lot of people will get them for Christmas.
Yeah.
Right, not monoculture. Okay, there are a few more comments.
Yes.
Do you want to pick up any that you feel you can make comment about?
Sure. I can see one. We will, as voters, need to lead. Will we need to lead political parties on this, rather than political parties offer us leadership? Definitely, we will 100% need to lead them. Political parties, by their not inherent nature, but historically, tend to be among the slowest to act. It's usually only when citizens are almost literally speaking out, crying out, that change happens. And when we look through our history, that's been the case right across the board, from sort of suffragette movements all the way up to sort of gay rights and legalizing marriage. It's tends to be when it's sort of inescapably loud that action happens. So yes, absolutely, we're going to need to take the lead, and we're going to need to push and make it impossible for them to ignore, I would say, before we get the sort of change that we all hope we can get.
Okay, Peter Jackson, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, and thank you. Yes, Dominic, I'd like to talk to you about today's announcement of approval for a new coal mine in Cumbria. Now, taking the optimistic view, that should be a short-term project to keep the lights on while we develop better and more renewables. So would you agree with that optimistic view, or are you in fact opposed to a new coal mine?
It's a very good question. I think particularly is that mine, if it's the one I'm thinking of, I think part of the process was that its use would be used for coking, so for industrial processes. In my personal view, I think at the moment, the way that energy stores are the way they are, there isn't the need for it, certainly this winter. And I would be very skeptical about awarding any sort of license to a new mine, simply because the company operating it needs to run it for at least usually 15 years or more before they'll make any money. So that's usually where that's granted. So I would be very skeptical of a claim for a short-term license given to a coal mine, for instance, because by their nature, they usually tend to run for much longer than a short term.
Yeah, I agree with that. So we have one more question, which is from Andreas Schneider, who is very optimistic about the range of your knowledge, Dominic. Can you tell us about the lasting effects of culling whales for lamp oil? Started in the 1700s and reduced the algae population drastically and still hasn't recovered. The effect on the atmosphere is still going on. But are people still culling whales for lamp oil? That bit's not clear.
It is interesting. The short answer is I don't know, I'm afraid, but I do know that there are significantly more protections in place to protect against whaling, particularly following 1980s, 1990s. So they're generally much more protected. So I wouldn't say that that practice is still happening. But as to the lasting effects, I don't know what lamp oil is comprised of. I would assume probably similar to paraffin, in which case, if that is the case, it's a hydrocarbon and therefore is most likely a fossil fuel constituent. So it probably is still kicking around in the atmosphere somewhere, but just in a fairly small percentage compared to carbon dioxide. That would be my guess.
May I say something to that? Because lamp oil was retrieved from whales by boiling their blubber. So it was just the oil that comes from the blubber. And the problem was that the whales produced a large amount of feces, which the algae fed on. And algae are a carbon sink, and they also produce a lot of the oxygen in our atmosphere that we use to breathe. And the whale population is still very much down, and it has a lasting effect on the algae population. Unfortunately, it didn't show in the 1700s. It was important for our industrial revolution and so forth, because we needed to work when it gets dark. And then electricity came along, so the need for lamp oil is not there anymore. But the effect is still there. And now we put plastic in the oceans, which also has a detrimental effect on algae.
Yeah.
So that's where my interest came from.
And as Dominic was saying, many of these things last for generations. We cause this damage, and then it's a long time before it ever can recover. Yep. So as if the lamp oil problem in the whales is the same. Even if we're not doing it anymore, it's still having a massive effect. Yeah, it's an interesting point. Thank you. So, do we have any more questions? No, I think not. No more on the chat. Would anybody like to say anything else apart from thank you very much to Dominic?
Well, yes, can I come in, John?
Yes.
I think Dominic has already touched on this, but my view is that hydrogen is one of the best ways to improve things. It produces no CO2. Its effluent is water or steam. And I was involved years ago with a local authority who wouldn't agree to having a hydrogen filling station on their patch, but that seemed to me a wrong proposal. I'd like to see what Dominic thinks about working on hydrogen as a very good way of avoiding fossil effluent.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a core part of the government's sort of net zero strategy. I think it definitely, so long as it's the right type, so long as it's green hydrogen, I think it's definitely a really promising area. And it's very useful for particular forms of transport or particular situations where you can't always have alternatives. So for instance, where we look at planes, if you were to try and put a lithium battery in a plane, the size of the battery that you would need would be so big, it would make it so heavy that the plane physically could not get off the ground. So you simply can't do it. The mechanics won't allow it. But you could use something like hydrogen as a fuel, and hydrogen fuel cells in cars. I think there's really good opportunity. We do need to be mindful of it, that the technology is still early, and there does need to be more attention paid to effectively how we use it well, how we make sure that it doesn't leak as much, for instance, how we make sure that it's stable, reduce the sort of inflammation risk. But that technology is there. There is work being done on it. It just needs to be scaled up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we're out of time. Dominic, thank you so much, particularly for answering all those questions, because you really did have an awful lot of quite tricky ones thrown at you, and you've handled them brilliantly. Thank you very much for sharing all of that information. Lots of it was very thought-provoking. I've certainly learned a lot. So many thanks. And let's give him a round of applause. You can unmute to do this. Thank you very much indeed, Dominic.
Thank you. No, not at all. It was great to talk, and great for you all to have listened to all of it and to pose such interesting questions as well. Like it's really nice to be part of such a well-informed and engaged group.
I'll share all of the links and all that kind of stuff that you sent out. I'll share them on the website.
Yes, please do. I'll send you my slides as well. So if people want to go through sort of personal actions, all those resources are there.
Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Cool. Thanks everyone. Take care. Bye.
Night.
Bye.
Bye.
It's very comprehensive. He was a good speaker. No, perhaps she was sitting on next to you, see her is leaving. Well, that's probably partly why.
Your conversation is audible, Frank. I don't know if you wanted it to be.
Well, no, I was just reflecting. I was half expecting you to say something about the schedule for next year, but obviously you didn't do anyway.
I didn't do, because we don't know what it is yet.
Oh, no, fine. Okay. No, it was no more than that, really, Jane.
Rosie and I are going to have a meeting next week, and we'll have some thoughts about it. But I've always got my ears open for anybody's ideas for things you feel we should be talking about. So
Okay,
let me know. Can think
fine,
about it.
excellent, Jane. Thank you, and thanks for a good evening.
Thanks. Thank you, Jenny. Great patience, and always great to see you, smiling and very fresh.
Okay, very nice to see you again, Nagyoti.
Yes, thank you so much. Bye, Jenny.
Bye-bye.
Not quite sure how I got invited to this meeting. I live in Bottrell's Lane.
Oh, hello.
I just wonder how on earth I can't find any reason why I was invited to the meeting, but
Oh, I see. Well, I put the word out quite a number of different ways. There was, do you get the email newsletter that comes out about in the local area? I pushed it in there.
see that every week. And
Yeah, well, it was in there.
I see, so perhaps that's where I picked it up from.
Maybe it is. Did you find it interesting?
Well, yes, I do. I'm only 92 years old, so I find some things a little different, but I've always been interested in the climate change and that. Try to do my own little thing, but of course life is not easy, so unfortunately one has to sort of just go with the flow in some cases.
Yeah, in some things, but I just think it's important that people are aware of what's going on.
Yes,
And, you know,
as far as energy
as-
concerned, I've got solar panels on my roof, and
oh, have you? Good for you.
in fact, today I spent about £4,000 on having a 3.2 kilowatt battery fitted to my solar system.
Oh, did you? So you could store it?
Yes, not that it's making very much these days.
Well, right at the moment.
Whereabouts do you live yourself?
Dodds Lane.
Oaks Lane?
Dodds Lane.
Oh, Dodds Lane. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh,
So
right.
we could practically shout at each other.
Oh, quite easily, yes. I mean, I was an electrician around here for 25 years, so
Oh, really?
I know a lot of houses. Dodds Lane. Yeah.
Well, very good to see you. Do you want to be told direct about talks when we organise them?
Yes, that would be very kind.
Okay. Give me your email address.
Yes, I'll say it and then I'll spell it if necessary.
Okay.
It's kcamil1@virginmedia.com. So
Okay.
no-
I've got the Virgin Media bit.
Yeah, okay. It says KAKER
KAKER. Yeah.
MILL
MILL.
and just the figure 1
Yeah.
at virginmedia.com.
So Caker Mill, MILL.
Yes, that's right.
Okie dokie.
That's the family home up in Cumbria.
Okay. So what I'll do, I will add you to the list, and you get a couple of emails a month. One of them tells you what the next talk's going to be, and one of them will tell you how to get the recording of the last talk.
Well, that would be interesting, yeah.
Okie dokie. I'll do that.
Very
Good to
kind.
see you.
Thank you.
All the best. Keep warm.
Unfortunately, I'm my wife's 24-hour carer now. She's got dementia, and
Oh, no, really? Oh, that's such a cruel disease.
yeah,
Terrible.
I need to go and see her now. I've left her
Yeah.
I left her watching the television, but she doesn't really remember what she's seen, although she keeps her quiet while she's watching it.
Oh, right. Okay. Well, give her all of our best wishes.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. I'm
Bye-bye.
going to switch off now. Bye.